The best shot an Iraqi tanker ever fired at an M1 Abrams did absolutely nothing. February 26, 1991. Southern Iraq, somewhere along the Medina Ridge. A T-72 gunner from the Tawakalna division of the Republican Guard lined up an American tank at under 2,000 meters. Good range. Clean sight picture. He sent a 125mm armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round downrange, the best anti-tank munition the Soviet Union exported to Iraq. The round hit the Abrams on the turret face. The crew inside felt the impact, heard the clang of tungsten against composite armor, and kept driving. If you had a family member who crewed an Abrams in Desert Storm or rode in any American armor during that 100-hour ground war, hit subscribe and leave their unit in the comments. Like the video so more people find these stories. The Iraqi gunner did everything right. That matters. He identified a target, acquired it quickly, and put a round exactly where Soviet doctrine told him to put it. Center mass on the turret. At that distance, the 3 BM-15 sabot round carried enough kinetic energy to punch through roughly 380 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel equivalent. Against a T-72 or an older NATO tank, that penetration value killed. Against the M1A1HA Abrams, it scored the paint. The after-action survey from 3rd Armored Division cataloged multiple Abrams tanks struck by Iraqi 125mm rounds during the Battle of 73 Easting and the engagements along Medina Ridge. The phrase that recurs in those reports is, "no penetration." Over and over, tank after tank, no penetration. So, what stopped those rounds? The short answer involves a classified armor package called Burlington, developed at the Chobham research facility in England, and then radically improved by American engineers at what became the Ballistic Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, Maryland. The long answer involves 40 years of Cold War paranoia, metallurgy that remains partially classified to this day, and a fundamental American bet that protection could outrun lethality in the arms race between tanks and the weapons designed to kill them. The Soviets bet the other direction. They poured resources into bigger guns, faster rounds, more energetic shaped charges. The Americans poured resources into making those weapons irrelevant. Both sides committed fully to their theory. Only one theory survived contact with reality. The Iraqi Republican Guard fielded the export variant of the T-72, not the top-shelf Soviet model with laminate armor inserts, but a downgraded version with thinner protection and older fire control. That distinction mattered enormously when Abrams gunners shot back. But the ammunition those T-72s carried came from the same Soviet factories that supplied rounds to frontline Soviet tank divisions in East Germany. The rounds performed as designed. They flew straight and hit hard, but failed to penetrate an armor system the Soviets had spent 2 decades trying to understand through espionage and never fully cracked. Colonel David Gruner pulled a classified folder off his desk at the Pentagon in 1976 and read an intelligence estimate that changed how the U.S. Army thought about tank warfare for the next 15 years. The Defense Intelligence Agency had compiled everything American analysts knew about the T-72, photographs from Soviet parades, signals intercepts, satellite imagery of production facilities at Nizhny Tagil, and a handful of reports from human sources inside Warsaw Pact militaries. The assessment concluded that the T-72 carried a smoothbore gun capable of defeating any armor the United States currently fielded, at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, firing on the move. Gruner's margin note, preserved in Army archives, read, "We need a new tank yesterday." He had reason to worry. NATO's entire defense of Western Europe rested on the assumption that Soviet armor would pour through the Fulda Gap in central Germany. Thousands of tanks in echeloned waves, trading losses for ground, grinding westward toward the Rhine. Wargaming at the National Training Center and in classified tabletop exercises at SHAPE headquarters in Belgium consistently produced the same result. NATO ground forces could slow the first echelon, maybe the second. The third echelon would break through. Every simulation assumed the T-72 as the backbone of those formations, and every simulation treated it as roughly equivalent to whatever the Americans put on the field. The M60 patent couldn't stop it frontally. The early M1 prototypes, then called the X-M1, showed promise, but production timelines kept slipping. Western intelligence made the T-72 into something close to a monster. Part of that came from genuine capability. The tank mounted a 125mm 2-46 smoothbore gun, fed by an autoloader that could cycle around every 6 to 8 seconds, faster than any NATO tank with a human loader, or so the analysts believed. It carried a low profile, just 2.2 meters tall, making it brutally difficult to spot hull down in the rolling terrain of the North German plain. Its diesel engine pushed the 38-ton chassis to 60 kilometers per hour on roads. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass production, and the Uralvagonzavod factory in Nizhny Tagil stamped out T-72's the way Detroit stamped out Chevrolets. By 1985, Western estimates placed total production above 20,000 hulls. 20,000. NATO had roughly 6,000 tanks of all types across the entire European theater. The numbers alone kept NATO planners awake. But the fear ran deeper than arithmetic. A CIA assessment from 1982, declassified in 2004, described the T-72's composite armor as likely incorporating ceramic elements of unknown composition. The phrase unknown composition appeared 3 times in 11 pages. American metallurgists at Aberdeen tested fragments recovered from a T-72 provided by Romanian intelligence through a back channel so convoluted it involved a Swiss intermediary and a cargo ship registered in Liberia. The fragments suggested a laminate of steel and glass textile plates, effective against shaped charge warheads, less so against kinetic penetrators. But the analysts couldn't confirm whether frontline Soviet models used the same armor package or something better. That uncertainty drove procurement decisions worth billions of dollars. The T-72's reputation also fed on what the Soviets deliberately showed the world. Moscow exported downgraded variants to Syria, Libya, Algeria, India, countries that paraded them through capital cities on national holidays, generating news footage that Western audiences consumed without understanding the difference between an export model and the version Soviet tank crews actually trained on. The T-72 M1, fielded by Soviet forces in East Germany starting in 1982, carried improved fire control, a laser rangefinder, and Contact 1 explosive reactive armor bricks bolted to the turret and glacis. NATO intelligence officers who tracked the upgrade program called it a different animal from the export variant. Their reports flagged the reactive armor specifically. American Tau missiles and French Milan anti-tank guided missiles, the backbone of NATO's infantry anti-armor capability, used shaped charge warheads. Explosive reactive armor degraded shaped charge penetration by 40 to 60%. If the Soviets bolted those bricks onto 20,000 tanks, NATO's anti-tank doctrine had a serious problem. So, the United States built the Abrams to kill something that might have been even more dangerous than the T-72 actually turned out to be. The armor package, the fire control system, the turbine engine, the ammunition, every major design choice on the M1 traced back to a single requirement: survive a frontal engagement with the best tank the Soviet Union could field, then destroy it before it fired again. The Abrams program spent 17 years and over $4 billion chasing a ghost that turned out to be smaller than the shadow it cast. A 6-inch square of armor plate sat on a laboratory bench at the Ballistic Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, Maryland, in 1978. It weighed 11 pounds. A comparable square of rolled homogeneous steel offering the same protection against shaped charge warheads weighed 43. 4-to-1 weight savings represented the single most important breakthrough in armored vehicle design since welded hulls replaced riveted ones in the Second World War. The British had started the work at their Defense Evaluation and Research Agency facility in Chobham, Surrey, layering ceramic tiles between sheets of steel and binding them with elastic resins that absorbed and distributed the energy of an incoming penetrator across a wider area than monolithic steel could manage. A shaped charge jet that would bore straight through 12 inches of conventional armor hit the ceramic layer and dispersed laterally, spending its energy sideways instead of forward. clever engineering. The Americans took it further. What happened at Aberdeen between 1977 and 1983 remains one of the Cold War's most tightly held secrets. The broad outlines have entered public knowledge through declassified procurement documents and congressional testimony. Engineers at the Ballistic Research Laboratory experimented with different ceramic compositions, aluminum oxide, boron carbide, silicon carbide, pressing them at extreme temperatures and testing each variant against captured Soviet ammunition. They fired hundreds of rounds into sample arrays. The results shaped what became the M1's Special Armor Package, designated Burlington in internal correspondence. Exact layer composition, thickness ratios, bonding agents, that information stays classified. The British don't have the full American specs. The Germans, who co-developed the Leopard 2 using their own Chobham variant, received a different formulation. Even within the U.S. defense establishment, access to Burlington armor data required a specific compartmented clearance that most general officers lacked. A 1984 memo from the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering described the armor program's classification as exceeding that of several nuclear weapons systems. Their words. Then came depleted uranium. DU changed the equation from impressive to absurd. Depleted uranium, uranium-238, with most of the fissile U-235 removed, carries a density of 19.1 grams per cubic centimeter. Steel sits at 7.8. At 19.1 grams per cubic centimeter, DU made a phenomenal kinetic energy penetrator, which the Army already knew. M829 sabot rounds used DU long rods to kill tanks at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. What fewer people outside the armor community understood, DU also made an extraordinary armor component. Starting with the M1A1HA variant in 1988, the Army incorporated depleted uranium mesh into the Abrams turret armor, sandwiching thin DU plates between the existing ceramic steel composite layers. The added mass pushed the tank's combat weight from 57 tons to over 61. The added protection made the frontal turret essentially immune to every anti-tank round in the Soviet export catalog and most rounds in the Soviet domestic inventory. How immune? Testing at Aberdeen subjected M1A1HA turret sections to the 3BM42, the top-line Soviet sabot round, not the downgraded export variant Iraq received. Penetration results from those tests remain classified. What filtered into unclassified literature through a 1993 Government Accountability Office report, the turret exceeded protection requirements against all known threat munitions at all engagement ranges. The GAO didn't use the word all casually. Their analysts reviewed the classified test data before writing that sentence. Iraq never had a chance of penetrating this armor. The 3 BM-15 rounds their T-72's carried generated roughly half the penetration energy of the 3 BM-42. An Abrams crew taking a hit from a 3 BM-15 on the turret face experienced a hard jolt and a loud noise. The round shattered against an armor array designed to stop something twice as dangerous. Staff Sergeant Anthony Davis of 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment described the sensation after his tank absorbed 2 hits at 73 Easting, like somebody threw a cinder block at a bank vault, equivalent to front-line Soviet stocks. That phrase appeared in Iraqi Ministry of Defense procurement documents recovered from a warehouse in Basra after the war. Somebody in Baghdad's military bureaucracy either believed it or wrote it down, knowing it wasn't true. The 3 BM-15 rounds Iraq purchased through Soviet export channels between 1984 and 1989 arrived in wooden crates stenciled with Cyrillic markings identical to those used for domestic Soviet ammunition shipments. Same factory codes, same lot numbers, different penetrator. The Soviet domestic 3 BM-15 used a tungsten carbide core surrounded by a steel sabot. The export variant Iraq received substituted a steel alloy penetrator with a thin tungsten sheath. Steel instead of tungsten carbide at the core, that single substitution cut penetration performance by roughly 20 to 25% against composite armor targets. Against homogeneous steel plate, the difference narrowed. Against layered ceramic steel arrays like Burlington, the difference became catastrophic. A tungsten carbide core maintains its shape during penetration, boring forward in a concentrated channel. A steel core deforms on impact, mushrooming outward, spreading energy across a wider area of the target plate. The ceramic layers in Chobham-derived armor existed specifically to exploit that deformation. Every millimeter of mushrooming reduced penetration depth. Iraqi tank crews had no way of knowing this. The rounds looked identical, loaded the same, fired the same. The muzzle flash, the recoil impulse through the hull. The acrid propellant smell that filled the fighting compartment through the autoloader port. All of it felt exactly like firing a first-rate anti-tank round. A Republican Guard gunner who put his reticle on an American tank and pressed the firing button experienced every sensory confirmation that he had just sent a killing blow downrange. The gun bucked. The tracer element on the sabot pedals flared bright orange against the desert haze. The round crossed 2,000 meters in roughly 1.2 watt-seconds. Then it hit. From inside the Abrams, crews described the impact differently depending on where the round struck. Turret face hits produced a deep metallic boom. Not a crack, not a ring, but a low-frequency thud that vibrated through the turret basket and rattled anything not bolted down. Loader specialist Kevin Olexa from 1st Armored Division's Iron Brigade told debriefers his first thought after taking a sabot hit on the turret cheek during the Medina Ridge engagement. He assumed something had fallen off the tank. A stowage box, maybe a track skirt torn loose by the terrain. The impact didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like road damage. He looked at his tank commander. His tank commander shrugged. They traversed the turret toward the source of the shot and returned fire. The Iraqi T-72 brewed up 4 seconds later. From the Iraqi side, the experience carried a different weight entirely. A gunner watches his tracer arc toward the target. He sees the spark of impact on the turret face, a bright flash where metal meets metal at over 1,500 meters per second. In his sight picture, the American tank keeps moving. No smoke, no secondary explosion, no crew bailing out. The round hit, and the target didn't care. Soviet training manuals told Iraqi crews that a center-mass turret hit with a sabot round produced a kill or a mission catastrophic failure on any Western tank. The manuals referenced the M60 Patton and the Chieftain. Nobody updated them for the Abrams. Sources conflict on whether Iraq ever received documentation specifying the export downgrade. A former Iraqi Armored Corps officer interviewed by the Gulf War Air Power Survey Team in 1993 stated that ammunition technical manuals provided by the Soviet military mission in Baghdad listed penetration values identical to those we later learned applied only to the Soviet domestic version. He described discovering the discrepancy after the war as a betrayal. Moscow sold Iraq confidence alongside ammunition. The confidence was the more dangerous product. It convinced Republican Guard commanders that their tanks could stand and fight American armor in a direct engagement. Soviet advisors who trained Iraqi crews through 1989 reinforced that message. Hold your position, take the first shot, aim for the turret. Doctrine built around ammunition that couldn't do what doctrine required it to do. 0430 hours, February 26, 1991. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment crossed the 61 Easting into a sandstorm that cut visibility to under 2,000 meters. Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop led with 9 M1A1s spread across a frontage of roughly 3 kilometers. They drove blind into the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard. The first Iraqi rounds came at 0442. McMaster's tank took a hit on the turret front from a T-72 dug into a reverse slope position at 1,400 meters. The crew felt a shudder through the hull floor. The thermal sight flickered for half a second, then stabilized. McMaster's gunner, Sergeant Craig Koch, already had the Iraqi tank in his reticle. He fired an M829 round. The T-72's turret separated from its hull in a column of white-orange flame. The autoloader's carousel ammunition cooking off in a single catastrophic detonation that killed everyone inside before the shockwave reached the desert floor. The engagement lasted 8 seconds from Iraqi first shot to Iraqi destruction. 73 Easting unfolded across the next 23 minutes. Eagle Troop destroyed 28 T-72's, 16 personnel carriers, 39 trucks. Iraqi gunners scored confirmed hits on multiple Abrams tanks during that span. Not a single American tank suffered a penetration. Staff Sergeant Davis's tank absorbed those 2 turret hits and kept fighting for another 11 minutes before the engagement ended. Specialist Robert Garza's loader hatch took a glancing sabot strike that gouged a furrow in the turret roof 3/8 of an inch deep. The round skipped off into the sand. Garza didn't know about it until the next morning. 2 days later at Medina Ridge, 1st Armored Division repeated the pattern on a larger scale. The Medina Luminous Division of the Republican Guard positioned roughly 300 T-72's in prepared fighting positions along a 6-kilometer front. The Iraqi crews fired first and scored hits. The M1A1HA turrets absorbed those hits the way a concrete wall absorbs tennis balls. 1st Armored Division destroyed 186 Iraqi tanks in 45 minutes. American tank losses to enemy fire at Medina Ridge, 0. The after-action review compiled by 7th Corps Headquarters used clinical language to describe something unprecedented. No American M1A1 suffered a crew fatality from enemy tank fire during the entire ground campaign. 72 hours of armored combat across southern Iraq. The records list 9 Abrams tanks damaged by enemy action. All 9 returned to service. The smell hit them first. Burnt propellant residue baked into steel by 48 hours of desert sun, mixed with petroleum and something acrid that clung to the back of the throat. Major Kenneth Grunewald led the 1st Battle Damage Assessment Team into the 73 Easting engagement area on February 28, 1991. His team carried cameras, calipers, depth gauges, and sheets of pre-printed forms designed at Aberdeen for exactly this purpose. They walked from tank to tank across a field of destroyed Iraqi armor, cataloging the dead machines. Then they turned to the American ones. Grunewald's team inspected 7 M1A1s that had taken confirmed hits during the engagement. The process took 11 hours. Each impact site received a photograph from 3 angles, a depth measurement, a width measurement, and a notation on the type of round that caused it, determined by examining fragments embedded in the armor face or scattered on the ground nearby. The forms had a field labeled penetration Y/N. Grunewald's team wrote N 7 times. On one tank, Davis's vehicle, they found 2 impact craters on the right turret cheek, 18 inches apart. The deeper crater measured 9 millimeters, not 9 centimeters, 9 millimeters into an armor array hundreds of millimeters thick. The round had hit at over 1,500 meters per second, generated roughly 500 kilojoules of kinetic energy, and dug a hole shallower than a house key is long. Around each crater, the paint had carbonized in a starburst pattern, roughly 2 feet across. Bare metal showed through the char. No cracking, no spalling on the interior face, no deformation visible from inside the turret. Davis's crew had fought the rest of the battle sitting behind armor that bore less structural damage than a car fender after a parking lot scrape. A separate assessment team from the Ballistic Research Laboratory arrived in theater on March 4th. These weren't combat troops doing field surveys. These were the engineers who had built the armor. They brought portable X-ray equipment and ultrasonic testing rigs powered by generators hauled on flatbed trucks across the desert. Dr. William Gooch, one of the principal researchers on the Burlington armor program, personally examined 4 Abrams tanks at a collection point south of Basra. His team's report, partially declassified in 1997, described the export 3 BM-15 impacts as producing superficial surface damage consistent with a threat significantly below the design threshold of the armor system. Gooch's handwritten notes from the field, preserved at the Army Research Laboratory archives in Adelphi, Maryland, contain a line that didn't make it into the formal report. Next to a sketch of an impact crater cross-section, he wrote, "This is what we built it for. It works." The Iraqi tanks told a different story in a different language. Grunewald's team also documented T-72 kills across the engagement area. The M829DU sabot round entered the turret face of a T-72 and exited through the rear armor plate, leaving an entry hole roughly 30 millimeters in diameter and an exit hole twice that size. The depleted uranium long rod penetrator passed through everything between those 2 points: the main gun breech, the commander's station, the gunner's station, the ammunition carousel beneath the turret ring. Internal temperature during penetration exceeded 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The DU fragments that remained inside the hull ignited spontaneously on contact with air, a property called pyrophoricity that turned every penetration into an incendiary event. Carousel ammunition detonated within milliseconds. Turrets launched off hull rings and landed dozens of meters away, leaving the lower hull sitting open to the sky like a steel bathtub. Gooch's team measured penetration channels through captured T-72 turret armor using the same instruments they had used on the Abrams. The cast steel turret of a T-72 offered roughly 400 millimeters of effective protection on the frontal arc. The M829 penetrated over 600 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel, equivalent at 2,000 meters. The round carried 40% more energy than the armor could absorb. The overmatch wasn't marginal, and it didn't depend on favorable angles. 40% excess penetration energy meant the round passed through the thickest part of the turret and still had enough residual velocity to kill everything behind it. The asymmetry in those numbers, 9 millimeters of crater depth on one side, complete through-and-through penetration on the other, captured something that no tactical narrative could. Eagle Troop didn't win at 73 Easting because McMaster's crews were brave, though they were. They didn't win because Iraqi crews were cowards, because they weren't. Men who stand in prepared positions and fire at an advancing enemy force in a sandstorm have made their peace with dying. Eagle Troop won because American engineers in laboratories in Maryland and Delaware and Surrey spent 15 years building an armor system so far beyond what the enemy could defeat. That courage on the Iraqi side became irrelevant. The 9mm crater on Davis's turret cheek measured the distance between bravery and capability. Bravery closed none of it. 0. That's the number of American tank crew members killed by Iraqi tank fire during the entire ground war. Not an acceptably low number. 0. 72 hours of the largest armored engagement since Kursk, and the enemy's main weapon system failed to kill a single crew member in a single American tank. The Soviet defense establishment understood what had happened before Baghdad did. Within 6 months of the ceasefire, the Russian Ministry of Defense convened a review board at the Kubinka Armor Proving Ground outside Moscow to assess T-72 performance against coalition forces. The board's findings remain classified by the Russian government. What leaked through defense attaché channels and open-source Russian military journalism painted a grim picture. Marshal Dmitry Yazov reportedly told a closed session of the Russian Security Council that Desert Storm had invalidated 20 years of Soviet export armor policy. His word, invalidated. He didn't say challenged or questioned, invalidated. Arms dealers across the globe felt the shockwave immediately. Nations that had purchased T-72's, and there were dozens of them, from India to Libya to Syria, started asking uncomfortable questions about what they had actually bought. The T-72 had entered the export market as the premier main battle tank available outside NATO. By March of 1991, it carried a reputation as a steel coffin. Fair or not, and the export downgrade on ammunition made the comparison deeply unfair to the tank itself. The market didn't care about fairness. The market cared about those turrets lying upside down in the Iraqi sand, separated from their hulls by their own exploding ammunition. Sales of Russian armor to new customers collapsed through the 1990s. American defense contractors filled the vacuum. The Abrams validated something beyond itself. It validated the entire philosophy that produced it. The willingness to spend enormous sums on individual platform superiority rather than producing acceptable platforms in massive quantity. The Soviets said build 10,000 adequate tanks. The Americans said build 4,000 that nothing on earth can kill, and spend whatever it takes on each one. February 1991 settled that argument with data the Soviets couldn't argue with and couldn't classify away. The wreckage sat in the open desert under satellite cameras belonging to every intelligence service on the planet. General Frederick Franks, commanding 7th Corps, submitted his after-action report to CENTCOM on April 15, 1991. The document ran over 200 pages. Buried in an appendix on equipment performance, a single paragraph addressed the M1A1HA's survivability record. Franks's staff wrote that the Abrams had exceeded all performance parameters established during developmental and operational testing. Exceeded all parameters. The tank performed better in combat than it had on the proving ground, a statement almost never true of any weapons system in the history of mechanized warfare. Aberdeen's test ranges had used Soviet specification penetrators for their trials. The Iraqis fired export-grade ammunition. The armor had been designed to stop the real thing, and in combat, it faced something lesser. The margin of American superiority turned out to be even wider than the engineers had predicted. Gooch flew back to Maryland on March 12th, and he carried 2 footlockers of armor samples, impact fragments, and field notebooks through customs at Andrews Air Force Base. The customs officer asked him what the metal fragments were. Gooch told him they were pieces of the future of armored warfare. The customs officer waved him through. Gooch drove to Adelphi, checked the samples into the Army Research Laboratory's secure storage facility, and sat down to write his preliminary field assessment. The report would take 4 months to complete. The classified version, when finished, contained performance data on the DU armor mesh that remains restricted to this day. 35 years later, the exact composition of the depleted uranium layer in the M1A1HA turret cheek has never appeared in any unclassified document. What sits inside that armor array? The specific geometry, the layering sequence, the alloy ratios, the manufacturing process that bonds uranium to steel? Who knows that, and who has it?